After 3 years in the Navy, I returned and found out that my wife had stolen all my family's money. The ship arrived early in the morning. I stepped off, feeling the ground under my feet again. 3 years had passed since I left. The time away had felt slow at first, then faster as the routine of service became normal. But no matter how many days went by, I always thought of home. I imagined what it would be like to return, to see my wife again, to feel like nothing had changed. I walked through the streets, recognizing everything, yet feeling distant from it. The houses stood where they always had. The roads led to the same places, but something felt off. Maybe it was just the feeling of coming back after so long. I tried to ignore it and kept walking. When I reached my house, I stopped. The yard looked abandoned, the grass too high, the plants overgrown. That wasn't right. My wife took care of these things. She knew I was coming home. My heartbeat picked up as I stepped closer. The door was locked. That had never happened before. She always left it open when she knew I was coming. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Harder. Still nothing. I reached into my bag, pulling out the spare key I had always carried. The lock turned easily, but when I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air inside was heavy. The furniture was still in place, but everything felt lifeless. I looked around. The shelves were nearly empty. The pictures that had once hung on the walls were gone. The small things that made this place feel like home weren't here anymore. I dropped my bag and moved through the house. The kitchen had open drawers, but most of the things inside were missing. The table was bare. The fridge door was slightly open. Inside, only a few bottles sat untouched. They had been there for a long time. I walked faster now. Every room I entered told me the same thing. The bedroom had no clothes left in the closet. My wife's side of the dresser was empty. The bed had no sheets. The bathroom shelves were nearly bare, only a few things left behind. I went to my desk in the study. The drawers were open. Important papers were missing. Some were torn or scattered. My hands shook slightly as I reached the closet and opened the small safe. I typed in the code and pulled the door open. It was empty. The money was gone. Every dollar we had saved. The emergency funds. The bonds my father had left me. Everything. I ran my fingers inside, hoping I was wrong, but there was nothing. I sat down on the floor, staring at the empty safe. My wife had taken it all. Not just the money. Everything. She hadn't just left. She had erased herself from this place, from this life. I stayed there for a long time, unable to move. My thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. Why? When? How long had she been gone? How had this happened without anyone telling me? The silence of the house was overwhelming. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I needed answers. I needed to know where she was, what had happened, why she had done this. I got up. Whatever had happened, it wasn't over. I left the house and walked down the street, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Something I had missed. My wife wouldn't just disappear without a reason. Someone had to know something. I needed to start asking questions. The first place I went was the neighbor's house. I knocked and waited. No answer. I knocked again. After a long pause, the door opened slightly. An older woman peeked out. She had lived next to us for years. I expected her to smile, maybe show some surprise that I was back. Instead, she barely looked at me. I asked about my wife, but she didn't say much. Just that she had moved out a while ago. When I asked for details, she avoided my eyes and mumbled something about not knowing much. That was strange. Neighbors always noticed things. People always talked. But she was acting like she wanted the conversation to end. I thanked her and left, feeling uneasy. I walked through town, thinking about where else to go. My wife had a few close friends, but I hadn't spoken to them in years. I decided to check the places she used to visit. The small cafe where she liked to sit and read. The grocery store where she shopped. The bank. The cafe was the same as always, but the staff had changed. No one recognized her name. The grocery store was no different. It felt like she had vanished without a trace. Then I went to the bank. I didn't have to ask any questions. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. The teller glanced at me, her face shifting as she recognized me. It wasn't a friendly look. It was the kind of look people give when they know something you don't. I walked up to the counter and asked about my accounts. The woman hesitated before typing into her computer. After a moment, she looked back at me. Her voice was careful, like she was trying to avoid saying something too direct. The accounts had been emptied. The transactions had been made over time. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The last withdrawal had been months ago. All of it was gone. I asked who had taken the money, but I already knew the answer. My wife. I stood there for a moment, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. I didn't know what to say. The teller asked if I needed anything else, but I barely heard her. I turned and walked out. The streets felt different now. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt real. The truth was sinking in, but I still didn't understand why. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My wife had taken the money. Legally, she had access to it. It wasn't theft, it was betrayal, but that wasn't a crime. I needed to find her. I went to the last place I could think of, her friend's house. It was on the other side of town, a small apartment where she used to visit often. I knocked, hoping someone would answer. The door opened, and a familiar face appeared. She looked at me, her expression blank. Then, without a word, she started to close the door. I stopped it with my hand. I didn't have time for games. I asked where my wife was. She didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she spoke. "She's gone." I asked where. She shook her head. "She left months ago. She didn't say where she was going." I stared at her. I didn't believe it. Someone had to know. Someone had to have seen her. I pushed again, but she wouldn't say anything else. She looked uncomfortable, like she wanted me to leave. I stepped back. There was no point in arguing. She wasn't going to help me. As I walked away, I realized something. People weren't just avoiding my questions. They were avoiding me. It wasn't just that my wife had left. It was that no one wanted to talk about it. Something wasn't right. I wasn't just looking for my wife anymore. I was looking for the truth. And I had a feeling I wouldn't like what I found. I walked aimlessly through town, my thoughts tangled in a mess of confusion and anger. Everyone I spoke to avoided the truth. It wasn't just that my wife had left, it was the way people acted when I brought up her name. There was something they didn't want to say. I sat on a bench, staring at the pavement. My savings were gone, my wife had disappeared, and no one wanted to tell me why. I wasn't going to get answers by asking politely. I needed to dig deeper. I thought about the places she used to go, the routines she had before I left. Some things had changed, but not everything. If she had been in town for months after I left, someone had seen her. Someone knew more than they were admitting. I decided to check the places where people talked the most. Bars, small diners, places where gossip spread easily. People might not tell me the truth directly, but they might let something slip. I walked into a bar where I used to go before I enlisted. It was dimly lit, quiet in the early afternoon. A few men sat at the counter, barely glancing at me as I entered. The bartender, a man I barely recognized, looked up. I ordered a drink and sat at the bar, waiting. After a while, I asked about my wife. He barely reacted, just wiped the counter and said he hadn't seen her in a long time. His voice was flat, careful, too careful. I didn't push. Instead, I listened. The conversations around me were about nothing important: work, weather, small town complaints. But then I caught something. A man at the other end of the bar laughed, shaking his head. "That woman ran off with everything," he muttered. My fingers tightened around my glass. I turned slightly, keeping my face neutral. The bartender gave the man a sharp look, and he shut his mouth. That was it. That was what I needed. Someone knew. I waited a while before I stood up, acting like I was leaving. But instead of walking out, I moved to the end of the bar and sat beside the man. He glanced at me, frowning slightly. "She took everything, huh?" I said. His jaw tightened. He didn't answer. The bartender was watching, so I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "I just got back. 3 years in the Navy. I came home to nothing." The man exhaled slowly, looking at his drink. He hesitated, then spoke. "She was here for a while, but she wasn't alone." My muscles tensed. "With who?" He shook his head. "I don't know his name, but she was with him. Everywhere. People talked, but no one said much to you, did they?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She didn't just leave. She planned it. He glanced at me, then lowered his voice. "People knew. They saw it happening, but no one was going to tell you. I sat still, trying to keep my breathing steady. They left town months ago, he added. No one's seen her since. I stared at the counter, my mind piecing everything together. She had taken the money. She had waited until I was far away, unable to do anything, and she had done it with someone else. I had expected betrayal, but I hadn't expected this. I pushed my drink away and stood up. I wasn't done. Not yet. If she thought she could disappear, she was wrong. I was going to find her, and when I did, I would make sure she understood exactly what she had done. I left the bar without saying another word. The streets felt even colder than before. The pieces were coming together, but I still didn't know the full story. My wife had left town with someone else. She had stolen everything, and the people here had known. Maybe not all of them, but enough. Enough to stay silent, to avoid looking me in the eyes. I needed more than rumors. I needed proof. There was only one place left to check the motel on the edge of town. It was where people stayed when they didn't want to be seen. If she had been planning to leave, she might have stayed there before disappearing. The walk was long, giving me too much time to think. I thought about our life before I left, how I had trusted her, how I had believed we were building something together. Now, all of that felt like a lie. By the time I reached the motel, my hands were clenched into fists. The building looked the same as I remembered, rundown, cheap, the kind of place where no one asked questions. I walked into the front office. A man sat behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. He looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he already knew why I was there. I asked if my wife had stayed there. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. She was here, he finally said. The confirmation hit like a punch, even though I had already known. With who? I asked. He shrugged. Some guy. Didn't ask his name. They paid in cash. How long? A couple of weeks. I clenched my jaw. She hadn't just left. She had settled here for a while, taking her time before disappearing completely. I asked if they had left anything behind. He shook his head. They were careful, cleaned out the room before they left. I should have expected that. She had planned everything too well to leave any clues. I turned to leave, but then he spoke again. They didn't leave anything behind, he said, but someone came looking for them after they were gone. I stopped. Who? He hesitated. Didn't say his name. But he wasn't happy. Looked like he'd been chasing them for a while. That was new. Someone else was looking for them. I felt a flicker of something, not relief, not hope, but something close. I wasn't the only one searching, and that meant I wasn't as lost as I thought. I stepped outside, trying to put the pieces together. My wife had run off with someone. They had stayed in town longer than they should have, and someone else was after them. I needed to find out who. I needed to know why. Because if I wasn't the only one hunting them down, then maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one they had betrayed. And that meant I had an advantage. I left the diner with a destination in mind. West. That was where she had gone, and I wasn't the only one following her. The man who had been looking for her, whoever he was, had a head start, but I wasn't far behind. I spent the next few days gathering whatever I could. I made phone calls, checked public records, and tracked every possible lead. Bit by bit, the picture became clearer. They had left town in a hurry, but they hadn't disappeared completely. A motel receipt, a security camera image, a careless signature on a rental car agreement, it was all there, waiting to be found. Then, finally, I found them. A small town, 2 states away. A cheap motel, just like before. It was too easy. After all that running, had she really thought she could hide forever? I didn't hesitate. I packed what little I had and drove through the night. My hands were steady on the wheel, my mind sharper than it had been in weeks. The anger was still there, but now it had a purpose. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting. The motel was run down, its neon sign flickering weakly. I parked across the street, watching. There was no need to rush. I had waited this long. I could wait a little longer. An hour passed. Then I saw her. She stepped out of one of the rooms, looking over her shoulder. Nervous, restless. She wasn't alone. A man followed, broad-shouldered, someone I had never seen before. I knew immediately This was the man she had left with. I stepped out of the car and crossed the street. She didn't see me at first, but when she finally turned and our eyes met, everything froze. Shock, fear, and then something else, resignation. She knew why I was here. The man beside her tensed, ready for a fight. But I didn't care about him. He wasn't the reason I'd come all this way. She was. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then she spoke. Quiet. Almost apologetic. But I didn't care about words. Words meant nothing now. I told her what I had come to say, that I knew everything, that I had seen what she had done, that she had left me with nothing, but I wasn't broken. Not anymore. She didn't try to explain. She didn't beg for forgiveness. Maybe she knew it wouldn't matter. I could have called the police. I could have walked away, but I did neither. Instead, I left her with the only thing she deserved: silence. I turned and walked away. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to take anything back. I had already won. She would spend the rest of her life running, looking over her shoulder, wondering when her past would catch up to her. But me? I was free. I got in my car and drove, leaving her behind for good. The past was over, and I was finally moving forward.